So, how is democracy linked to conflict? How did different democratic and autocratic institutions link to the causes of conflict? That's a great question, one in which we're not going to be able to completely answer today, but I wanted to highlight several of the most important areas of research so far that have linked democracy and democratic institutions to conflict. And once we have that foundation, later on we can delve into more granular detail, the type of institutions and how they actually link to greed, grievance, economic or political motivations for using violence. And this photo here, I think, is evocative for some of the challenges that democracy is facing in recent years. The photo also reminds me of a time I spent during an election campaign period in the United States in 2000 that basically, I don't think any of the ANU students who were starting this year were actually born during that 1999 and 2000 election season and counting. But it was chaos. Luckily, I was working on a sailboat going down through the Red Sea and the Mediterranean from Cyprus down to Kenya, and I used to listen on a shortwave radio um, because we didn't have satellite phones or satellite radios back then, to try to get a sense with BBC World Service what was going on with this democratic system that I had grown up with and take it for granted. And we would just anchor in different parts of the Red Sea, and we stopped in Massawa in Eritrea and a couple of other islands north and south of it, and we saw some ships like this that were rusted out that had been destroyed during the recent Eritrean Ethiopian war that Eritrea and Ethiopia, two countries in Eastern Africa, had fought in from '98 to 2000, and had a even longer independence struggle that the Eritreans had fought against Ethiopia. And I think it's an interesting example of people resisting the institutions that others had created in a system that they didn't feel reflected their interests and their desire to participate. Eritrea fought a long and bloody battle to be able to secede from Ethiopia, and by so doing, taking away Ethiopia's access to the sea. Um, but it also, I think, is ironic because when we look at the democratic institutions of Ethiopia and Eritrea, and when you look at freedom struggles, you can see and often sympathize with the people that are fighting to be free, coming from the United States, at least, that you think that fighting for your rights would end up leading in to more freedoms. However, if you look at measures of Ethiopia and Eritrea since independence, basically you see that Eritrea would be considered an autocracy recently, while Ethiopia would be considered an anocracy, a system that has some democratic and some autocratic characteristics, especially after the election that brought in a reformer in 2018. So you have two independent states now that fought a war both against each other and a freedom war, civil conflict to be able to secede from the other country, and you have institutions that aren't necessarily as democratic as people might have expected during the conflict. And I think what's notable also from this case is the fact that these two states fought an interstate war against each other, but they were not considered democracies, and so the main driving force for the political institutions and conflict literature still remains the democratic peace. I don't know how many of you have come across the democratic peace before, but it is as close, as Jack Levy would say, to an empirical law that we have in political science, that no two democracies have ever fought each other. And This is when definitions of democracy become important, right? How do you define what a democracy is might shape whether you think this empirical finding still holds or not. Hegre outlines some et al. Some explanations for this empirical regularity, normative explanations that democratic societies have these implicit and explicit norms of negotiation, discussion, participation, reciprocity that would allow states who might have differences of interest to be able to negotiate without using actual war. Democracies might also have legislative constraints in the declaration of war that might give more time or more incentives to not use conflict. Being a democracy can also signal resolve if the state actually has constraints on its ability to go to war. Then, if there is public support for the conflict, or if there is legislative action in support or declaration of war, that signals more of a sincere resolve for a state than in an autocracy in which they might find it easier to back down because they don't have the same audience costs, or to make promises or show that say that they're resolved, in which there is little independent evidence of it. Right. Democracies also can mobilize more quickly. They have transparency in the mobilization process because of the accountability that the executive has to the legislature. And democracies, through history or norms, might have joint interests, which is going to connect to what we're going to look at a bit later. That democracies might have joint interests that would give them greater incentives to cooperate and not actually go to war. Those joint interests can also be thought of as falling into the Kantian explanation for the democratic peace, the Kantian triangle. I drew this triangle because I'm a visual learner and I want to try to look at the different relationships between these three factors that Immanuel Kant thought would lead democratic states to be less likely to go to war with each other. The three corners would be the democratic institutions and the issues and reasons that Hegre already talked about earlier. Economic independence. Democracies are more likely to trade with each other. They will have contracts that are less likely to be invalidated. You have the capacity to have resolve and predictability in the interactions. You don't have to worry about the leader changing and all the institutions being thrown out. Democracies are also more likely to join international organizations, the United Nations, World Trade Organization, the UN Council on Human Rights, other bodies that would allow accountability as well as negotiations to fall short of war. And so I think the main point is that all these different factors, democracy included, have reciprocal effects with each other that all kind of point towards decreasing the likelihood of conflict breaking out and increasing the likelihood of peace. This, I think, also showing all the different arrows going the different ways, shows you the prevalence and the possibility for endogenous relationships between two factors, two issues that we'll look at in the world, that you can say that economic development can lead to lower risk of peace, lower risk of conflict, but conflict itself can also lower levels of economic development, right? That you can draw arrows going lots of different ways. These are 12 arrows right here, but you could break up any of these for your own research or your own interests to look at how democracy leads to more involvement in international laws or organizations, how peace can also lead to democracy over time. You can think of a lot of these different kind of relationships. I think the main point is that the more tied countries are to each other, the less likely they are to have conflict with each other. And this is at the national level, countries fighting with other countries. There's been a couple of other theories for why countries go to war with each other or not. This is a whole huge literature we're not going to touch on today. But the democratic peace international conflict literature connects to the democratic arguments for why it increases or decreases the likelihood of civil conflict. Another possible explanation would be the Big Mac theory of war. Tom Friedman he's a New York Times opinion columnist, long time. He wrote this article back in 1996, in which he argues that no two countries that both have a McDonald's have ever fought a war against each other. So maybe it's not necessarily democracy. Maybe it's something economic, right? This is a map of countries that have McDonald's. You notice the different colors or how long they've been there. There's a lot. This is the most recent graph that I could find. But maybe there's an economic globalization argument that's really driving peace, that isn't really included in that kind of Kantian triangle, but it also holds for the increasing integration of different societies. McDonald's is involved in a couple of other different measures of international relations. One also that I think you might be interested in is the Economist Big Mac Index. McDonald's, whenever you're traveling, can be a refuge, at least as an American, for dependably mediocre, safe, and indestructible food. And the one thing you might have noticed already is when you go to different countries, different countries have different prices for the same goods that you would get in different countries. Kind of like in the 90s when I would go to Europe, and American jeans would cost a fortune in Poland or some other country. So The Economist has another measure of international globalization, differences between countries, by looking at the prices of Big Macs. And their Big Mac index is updated pretty regularly. You can see it online. The takeaway that I took from it in checking it most recently is that the Australian dollar is, according to the Big Mac, 20% undervalued compared to the US dollar. Silly ways of kind of finding proxies or measures of the world that might explain some kind of conflict outcomes. This leads me to my second lecture question. I don't have a slide for it. Can you think of any other measures of culture or economics that could be useful for correlates of peace? Can you think of any other measures of the world that I might not have thought of, or other political theorists might have thought of, that might be related with both conflict, right? Outside these kind of main GDP or democracy measures that we're looking at. Feel free to stop the video now, answer it on Waddle, or think about it, and then come back and answer it at the end of this video. So, given our understanding of what democracy and democratic and autocratic institutions are, and this democratic peace regularity, how do these institutions relate to civil conflict? The takeaway from this graph and the graphs for the readings for this week and other research over the last 20 years is that there is basically an upside-down U relationship between political institutions and conflict. It might vary a little bit. This is kind of a lopsided U here. It looks more like the Matterhorn than an upside-down U. But basically, democracies and autocracies at the extremes of the political system have a lower chance of conflict, civil conflict, than those that have some democratic or autocratic characteristics. This comes from the Political Instability Task Force. It's one of the efforts in the United States, maybe across campus. They have it more in Australia, in which they have the government soliciting advice from academics on political phenomenon. My dissertation advisor played a role on the Political Instability Task Force, in which they were tasked by the U.S. government to try to look at what were the best predictors of violence. Democracy and mixed democratic systems were one of those crucial kind of factors. You can see this in a couple of different dimensions. This graph from the Hegre et al. 2001 article for today adds another dimension. You see the inverted U in this kind of three-dimensional slope here, but the additional thing that they add is the years since there has been regime change. The argument is that there is this inverted U relationship between civil war and political institutions, but the longer that you have a given political system, the more use political leaders and opposition groups and civilians are to working within that system, the less likely there is to be a civil conflict. You can make an argument about whether that's because the costs of rebellion are higher, the benefits of working within the system are higher, or whatever. Um, but I think the takeaway from this is that this U is there, but time also matters for how dramatic that U shape is. So, what are the relationships between democracy and conflict given the cross national studies? A couple of main kind of points. Democracy overall should decrease violence. Established democracies are less likely to have violence. Collier, in his War, Guns, and Votes, argues that it's because of increasing levels of accountability and legitimacy in democracies that people are more likely to acquiesce to political institutions or outcomes that might not be beneficial for them because the people or the institutions that are making the decisions are perceived as having legitimacy. But the Collier, because he is an economist, of course, finds a link between democracy and national income in relationship to violence. As low incomes, democracy increases violence. In that introductory chapter to his book, which I have someplace, that high income democracy decreases violence. At low income, democracy increases violence. The inflection point he finds is around $2,700. I think that also ties into the perceived legitimacy of the leaders and how much public goods the government can be able to provide to their citizens. So, who are these political leaders? This one photographer has taken a whole bunch of photos of a whole bunch of different leaders around the world. And so you see the faces of the decision makers in a lot of different contexts. Gaddafi, there in this, is no longer with us. Leaders might come and go, but the interests that they represent, whether economic or democratic or interest groups, might last. As you can see, there could be quite noticeable differences between one administration and the next, and with Australia as well. Why do I have two pictures of Morrison? I don't know. I like the one with the flag. Anyway, you can see different leaders might have different interests, and different systems might have different numbers of leaders transitioning over time. One kind of charismatic example of this would be the country of Turkmenistan. I don't know how many of you have come across Turkmenistan before in any of your other classes or your readings, but since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, there's only been two presidents of this small, largely landlocked country with a lot of natural resources. Turkmenbashi was the first leader. He was the leader before the end of the fall of the Soviet Union. After Saparmurat Niyazov in Ashgabat, the capital of Turkmenistan. I was there in 2000, and I was just absolutely amazed because they had this huge golden statue of, he called himself the father of the Turkmen, and his statue would rotate with the sun, so that it would always seem like he was the one that was deciding where the sun was going, or that he was always facing the sun. So there's definitely some hagiography or nation building through the leadership in a country that's, I don't think anyone would claim to be a strong democratic system. He was succeeded by the current president now. I'm not going to try to pronounce his name. I think both have an interesting story in how they decided to rule. When I was in Turkmenistan, you see Turkmenbashi's hair there is silver. He used to dye it, and dye and changing the color of his hair. And he had photos of himself all over the country. And one day he decided to stop dyeing his hair, and so they had to go and repaint all those paintings all over town. His successor ended up doing something similar in 2018. All of a sudden, he stopped dyeing his hair, and so people were encouraged to stop dyeing their hair as well to encourage the growth of the gray. I don't know how many of you watch John Oliver, sorry, weekly show, but he has a couple memorable segments of the current president of Turkmenistan's abilities to rap, to ride a bicycle while shooting guns, and of course have less democratic institutions that repress citizens, high levels of inequality and non-transparency with natural resource exports. So I've linked a couple of videos showing his exploits, give you a bit of a break from me, and then we'll come back and continue the discussion.